Hello, everyone, and welcome into the latest episode of the SPYPOINT Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Marsh. And before we get started, I want to remind everybody to rate, review, subscribe wherever it is you're consuming this podcast. Make it easier to find this content for everybody. And the content today, I think, is going to be really interesting and really relevant to a lot of our listeners. Joined today by someone that can provide us some insight into something that hopefully we are all about to be doing ourselves. Will Morgan joined today, the marketing director for Outdoor Edge Knives, one of the most reputable knife brands out there. Thrilled to have Will on the podcast today, and we're gonna talk about processing deer. And before we get into all of that, want to let Will introduce yourself and kind of explain what it is you do at Outdoor Edge, how you got there, and what that journey's been like.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Trent. It's been quite an interesting journey on how I got here. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family that owned a restaurant, but also very active in the outdoors, and consuming wild game was a part of our life. So this topic is very near and dear to me. The journey on how I got to Outdoor Edge was after college. I moved to Colorado to be a fly fishing ski bum. So I did that for several years, and kind of hit a point in my fly fish guiding where I was looking for something more. Got in with a marketing agency in 2012, and Outdoor Edge was actually one of our clients for several years. And right in the middle of the pandemic, they saw a massive growth opportunity with knives and cutlery and game processing that they needed to bring marketing in-house. And 2 years later, here I am still with the company, still driving the concept of affordable game processing, replaceable blade hunting knives, and all that good stuff forward.
Awesome. And for those that don't know, and we'll get into it a little bit more, I've always kind of been around, where my schema for Outdoor Edge was always the hunting knives. But there's also, you've also a whole line of like fillet knives and that kind of stuff as well, correct? It's not just hunting knives.
Yeah, that absolutely. Fishing knives, fillet knives, as you mentioned, everyday carry knives, whether they are a traditional blade or our razor safe replaceable blade system, hunting knife combos, individual hunting knives, and then as we'll get into today, our complete line of game processing knives.
So we'll kind of kick off there, and it's I'm someone that grew up in a family that we never processed our own deer. My dad would go hunt, and it would, we'd take it to one of the local lockers and it would get processed there. And I don't know, I suppose it was several years after college when I kind of got back into hunting and everything. After college, I just decided I didn't see the purpose, because I was just out of college and broke, to pay someone else to process that game. But then, you hear the horror stories. My local processors are all pretty good, but you hear the horror stories about not getting your deer back, or whatever the case may be. And I like the idea of doing it myself. That's just the kind of person I generally am anyway. So that was kind of my thought process when I started processing my own deer. So are you seeing more people do that? I know you mentioned the pandemic, and we've kind of had the outdoors was the only thing people could do, and some folks have gotten either back into it or introduced to it because it was all they could do during the shutdowns. Are you seeing more people lean towards doing it themselves as opposed to taking it somewhere?
Yeah, I think we are. And I mean, Trent, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about some of the horror stories that you hear of people, dropping off their deer and then getting something back that is, borderline inedible, not knowing if it is your game or not. I think, the pandemic, absolutely. And it's not so much just the, influx of people. That's all they could do was go outside, but we saw some of those, supply chain shortages. You go to the supermarket, and, the meat shelf was kind of borderline bare. Maybe the only thing was like a pack of hot dogs or something. So
Right.
I think that really kind of spurred a lot of the individual awareness on where your food's coming from, understanding the food source, the spike in the pandemic, getting more people outside. I mean, I think pretty much every state saw record license sales for hunting and fishing license the past couple of years. I think that trend will continue. And we also have to give credit to individuals such as Stephen Ranella. I mean, he's done a phenomenal job shedding light on game processing and bringing that game and sharing that game with, friends and family, and educating people on, this topic isn't as intimidating as one might think. Sure, you're going to make some mistakes, but it's easy to learn. It's affordable. You can save a lot of money. As you mentioned, being a poor college kid right out of college, and I think I can relate to that. A lot of other people can relate to that. Maybe it's only $150 to get your deer processed, but that $150 could probably go a long ways when you're
Right.
flipping couch cushions, looking for dimes and nickels to get through.
Right. Well, and you mentioned something that I guess I hadn't thought about it in that context too, but I'm in Indiana, so we're kind of in the middle. We've got feedlots and we've got, hog operations and that kind of thing. And when they started shutting down the processing plants, you had hog operations here locally saying, we have hogs for sale that have nowhere to go, come buy them. And the local butcher shops that are traditionally handling, the bulk of that deer processing, I'm taking pigs in this week because we always do feeder hogs. So I take pigs into the butcher every October, and I have to make my kill dates at this point a year out, because if you wait, there's just no bandwidth. And it's still super busy, but they definitely don't have the openings and even a lot of the deer processing. And I guess I just forgot about mentioning. I mean, even talked to a couple of them last fall, and they're like, honestly, we would much rather anything you can do yourself. If you want to bring them in to have snack sticks made or summer sausage or something like that, then great. But if you just want, backstraps butterflied and some roasts done up, like if you can do it yourself, you're going to be way better off. And then, we started seeing a lot of the fees go up too, because they had everything else that was kind of consuming their time, where it used to be, $20 for carcass disposal and that kind of, and then it went up to skinning was $25 all by itself. And then carcass disposal was another 20. It wasn't necessarily that getting your meat cost more. It was all those other fees that they just said, look, if we have to take time away from, sheep and hogs and cattle processing, we have to make it worth our time. It's been an interesting, the last few years have been interesting in a lot of ways, but I guess I hadn't even really thought about it until you kind of mentioned it in that way, that it's kind of changed a lot of things that had been the same for a long time. It was impetus for a lot of change in that regard.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, we see it out here. I'm friends with a couple, taxidermists that also do a bunch of game processing, and they're out multiple weeks on elk. And obviously an elk takes quite a bit more time than a small whitetail, but same thing. It's bandwidth, and they're always trying to find people to help cut. And that's another major issue, of just getting the bodies in there to help with some of these processing places.
So as people have decided that they're going to start trying to process their own game, obviously there's a learning curve, like you mentioned, and it can be intimidating. If you've never broken an animal down before, from chicken up to elk, if you've just never taken the time to actually break an animal down yourself, there's a learning curve there. And the word you mentioned was intimidation, and I think it kind of falls in the same category as fly fishing and trapping, where if you don't have somebody where you're raised up to be able to show you this is how you do this, it's something that people kind of shy away from, even though they probably are more than capable. They don't really know where to begin. And obviously, living in the age that we do, YouTube and, between podcasts and videos and all that kind of stuff that just didn't really exist, even a generation and a half ago. Because of that learning curve, there's always those kind of low-hanging fruit mistakes that people make. So when you talk to people or interact with folks that are using the game processing tools, what are some of those common themes of mistakes that you see people make that just really just born out of inexperience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I see, and friends that I've gotten introduced into hunting and game processing is really having the right facility and the right setup to properly, if you want to hang the meat for the quarters for a few days, keep them nice and cool. That's the number one key, is keeping that meat nice and cool. and then, removing anything that looks a little suspicious, like, we always have this term, it's like, not in my kitchen when we're cutting something up. It's like, there's some gristle, some silver skin. It's like, I wouldn't eat that. Let's, cut all of that, gristly stuff that it's unappealing. Get rid of that. And another thing is, as we talk about the intimidation factor, it's, once you kind of start diving into, a hind quarter or a back strap, it's just really following those, the connective tissue that separates each individual muscle. And a lot of times you can just get in with your fingers and almost kind of peel that muscle apart, and then just kind of use the knife tip and kind of work it apart until you can isolate those individual muscle groups. And I think that is the biggest mistake that people maybe make as a start, or intimidated on where do I begin. It's just following those muscle groups until you have everything pulled off of the bone, and then work individual muscles and clean them up into a roast, or cut them into steaks, or put them into a bag for, grind, snack stick, sausage, and things like that.
Yeah, it's definitely, when you say where to start, when you talk about processing your game, it kind of has multiple meanings, because the first thing is, don't think about it as breaking down a deer. Just think of it as, okay, I want to process this backstrap. What am I going to do with this? I need to process this hind quarter. What do I need to do with this? Don't think about it in terms of that entire animal, to get it broken down into those major parts. And that's, hanging is something that, we actually just had a blog on it about, because a lot of people say, well, I need to let it age for 3 or 4 days. 3 or 4 days isn't really doing you any good anyway. And in the grand scheme of things, there's some benefit there, but you're not like aging beef. Like it's a very different process when you really get into that. But something I've started doing, well, I guess in the last decade or so now, is I'll wet age, just because I don't have a lot of time. So I try to break it into just, because it's to break down even a small deer, you've got hours in it by the time you're completely done. So wet aging it, I'm able to get everything off the bone basically right from the get-go. Goes in a cooler, ice and water, flush that blood out of there, and then I've got 3 or 4 days pretty comfortably that I can keep that venison cold on ice, take care of what I need to take care of. And I generally I get the backstraps taken care of, because I know what I'm going to do with those get broken down into medallions, go into the freezer, trimmed up nice and clean. And then I'll break down usually the hindquarters after that, just because it's the next kind of biggest step. If I want to do some roasts, or I've started canning a lot of venison here lately as well too. So I'll can a lot of the hindquarters, and then I'll get into the shoulders. And then by the time you're done, all you've got left is that you've kind of accumulated over the last couple of days that can just kind of live in a big tub in the fridge, all that trim meat for a burger or anything else. And you didn't have to sit down and dedicate 6 hours of an evening or take a day off work. You can kind of pick at it and, take an hour and get your backstrap sorted out, take an hour and get a hindquarter sorted out, and just kind of be able to pick through things that way. And it just, even for me, I mean, I've been doing my own for years. It's still an overwhelming process. My boys aren't old enough to help yet. They want to, but all they're going to do is cut themselves or spill something or whatever. So, so it's nice that they're there to watch and they can hang out, but same thing, they're going to get bored with it after about the first hour. So trying to just manage those bite-sized pieces of processing the game, as long as you've got somewhere that you can store it in the interim, has been helpful for me, because I don't feel like I have to rush through it to get it done. I can take my time and make sure that this gets done right, handle it all right from the get-go, and then moving forward, it's easier to manage.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, just focusing on those individual muscle groups and doing it right from the start. And don't think that it has to be done in that immediate time, that immediate evening, as long as you can keep it nice and cool. You wet age, I hang a lot of stuff. So as long as it stays at that good, cool ambient temperature and there's good airflow on it, I'm confident in letting that stuff hang for, 2 weeks if the air temp's right, and
Right.
it really buys you the time. And like you said, people want to hang it for a couple days. Really, all you're doing there is just putting off the inevitable of having to jump into it, because you're not really, reaping those benefits of hanging.
Right. Yeah, for sure. It's something like around here, Northern Indiana, we're kind of right on the edge of that kind of cool weather, warm weather breakover. You know what I mean? I mean, when talk about hunting in hot weather in Northern Indiana, if it's 70, they're like, oh, it's too hot to go hunting. Well, the guys in Georgia are thrilled if it's only 70 when their season opens. Right, exactly. So it's all relative to kind of what you were raised up around and what you got used to. And it's, we've talked about it on the podcast before, but I think it's something that people get hung up on a lot of times, because same thing out west. You're not going to be able to, especially if you've got an early tag somewhere. Yeah, it may be cooler.
Archery season is September, and I mean, it's 80, 90 degrees a lot of those days, and you do not have that luxury. It's right. You're up against the clock.
Yeah. But as long as you've got the temperature of the meat headed in the right direction, having talked about it with folks in the past, if you can get that animal broken down, get it gutted, and at least start bringing that temperature down. As long as the temperature's headed down, you're fine. You don't have to go from 98.6 to 40 degrees in 2 hours. It doesn't have to be that way. You've got time to be able to get that animal broken down, get it headed the right way. On a morning hunt, you've got till evening, as long as it's going to get cool this evening, like you can, as long as the temperature is always headed down, it's where it stagnates. When it kind of hits that 60, 70 degree mark, that's super, super conducive to bacteria growth. And then it just kind of levels there. Once it stops cooling, that's when the clock really starts running on your game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, another thing too is if, you have the luxury of getting it off of the bone too, that really helps open it up and lets out a lot of that heat as well. You talk to a lot of people, where maybe they, they're archery elk hunting, or, I talked to a lot of guys up in Alaska moose hunting, and the meat will bone sour. It'll start kind of rotting from the bone out. So if you can peel that meat off of the bone, open it up, that drastically helps that cool down process too.
So and obviously ambient conditions make a big difference, and there's no 100% rule. What's kind of your guideline? If somebody comes and asks you, how long do I have to get this done? What are you going to be telling people in terms of what their time frame looks like for just a normal situation?
I mean, that's kind of a loaded question. What would you consider a normal situation?
I didn't say it was going to be easy. I just said there was a question.
I think if it's like you said, if it's getting down, in the 40s at night, low 40s, and not really getting that warm in the daytime, you have a couple days, I would say. And I'm speaking on elk, which those hindquarters are much larger. So once they cool down, they seem to kind of hold that cooler temperature a little bit longer. Now, if you could get it into a fridge or a walk-in, I mean, I've hung elk for close to 3 weeks before and not had any issues. Granted, it forms a pretty big rind, so you lose a little bit more waste as it ages. But like I said, in the right conditions, you have a couple of weeks easily to work with it, and then you can just kind of chip away on it, an hour after work, here and there, and get it kind of cut and how you like. But if you're just hanging it in your garage, I would say a couple of days is probably as much as you want to let it hang. And I'm not a big advocate of letting stuff freeze. Now, I grew up in northern Wisconsin, so our gun season was over Thanksgiving, and it was pretty common that you shot something, you hung it, it would freeze within a day or two. So that always kind of had a little bit of effect on the flavor, as far as I'm concerned, on how it finishes, how it cuts, how it ages. So if you can keep it from freezing, that's ideal. That 38 degrees is 37, 38 degrees is kind of the magic mark that I try to abide by.
You always know, for me, you always notice it in the texture really bad. Anytime a meat is thawed, frozen, like when it's kind of gone back and forth, it takes on a really, it doesn't even matter what animal it is. It gets grainy. It's almost like freezing dairy. Like it doesn't have that right texture after the fact once it's freezing, thawed, and gone through that cycle a couple times.
Yeah, it'd be pretty much just good for like stew meat or burger.
Exactly. Yep. So you vacuum pack? Is that kind of your preferred method for long-term storage, or butcher paper wrap? Or
I love the vacuum seal for a burger. You can throw a pound of burger in there, vacuum seal it, press it flat, it thaws out super quick. You have kids, I have kids. It's kind of nice for that quick, convenient, pull out a pack of burger, throw it in the sink, it's thawed out in a couple minutes. Now,
right.
For all my major cuts, back straps, roast, things of that nature, I grew up doing the plastic wrap and butcher paper, and I still do that for all of my major cuts. I feel like I can get a tighter seal on it. I've had stuff in the freezer, it's always unfortunate when you dig in the bottom of the freezer, you find a chunk of backstrap that's a couple years old, but I've had some of those occasions and pulled something out from the bottom of the freezer and thawed it out, and it's still been in really good shape. Doing the plastic wrap and freezer paper. So what about you? What's your go-to for long-term storage?
It depends, but I think the freezer burn risk has always been overstated. If you're wrapping it properly in freezer paper and butcher paper, it's got to be like, you're not going to freezer burn something in a year or two. So I've had pretty good luck, but I've gotten to the point where it's just so easy to because same thing with backstrap. So I do it a little bit different. And I've done it both ways, but when I go to process it, I cut it into medallions right away. I don't like a lot of guys will take like a third or a half of a strap and they'll freeze it whole. And then when they want to thaw it, they'll thaw it out. Then they'll cut it in the portion that they want because they're worried about it freezer burning and whatever the case may be. But I cut it into medallions and kind of lay it in, like nest them on top of each other so that same thing. So they'll lay flat and vacuum pack that down. And I had just earlier this summer from a doe from 3 years ago out of the bottom of the freezer when I was moving stuff around. Oh, this fell down here, and opened it up. And if I'd have told you that it was last fall's deer, you wouldn't have known any different.
That's awesome. Yeah.
So I've just the simplicity of put it in the freezer bag, suck it all the way down, get a nice tight air sealed out. But also your freezer makes a big difference too. I mean, because we do the feeder hogs, and we do a quarter or half of beef to go along with stuff, generally once a year. So we've got a good deep, it's not just like a commercial, the top of because that makes a difference. If it's a good deep freeze, you just don't have the issue. You don't have the swings and the variance with a good quality freezer. And that doesn't seem like it gets talked about as much, but if it's in the same freezer that your kids are always in and out of for popsicles and ice cream sandwiches, like you're just not going to have that consistent long-term cold storage, which even if it doesn't fully thaw, just that temperature swing up and down and getting the frost on the packaging. And especially if you're not doing a vacuum sealer, if it's something like just a wrapped paper and it's not wrapped up really well, warm air intrusion in there, just, even a few degrees over the course of a year or two, you're going to run into issues. And that's where you're going to get your freezer burn and run into issues. So I still wrap a lot of stuff too. It just kind of depends on what mood I'm in and what it happens to be. If I have a bigger roast, obviously that's really tough they don't make the bags big enough to be able to get it sucked down and that kind of thing. So that stuff will all get wrapped. The next thing I think I'm going to experiment with though, is I want to do a corned venison brisket as opposed to corned beef. I think I want to take a brisket out and do a full-on corned venison and make some venison Reuben sandwiches. I think that's probably on the list for if I get a tag punched this fall. And so I'll wrap that up. probably in some sections and do that too. But like I said, if you're doing it right, wrapping or vacuum sealing, but you're 100% right on the burger, throwing that in, yeah, you can have it thawed in a half hour. And I've gotten to the point too, everybody puts everything in a pound package. And especially if you go and don't process it yourself, that's what you're going to get. You can't get anything packaged less than a pound. But a lot of times I don't want a full pound like in my marinara, or, if I'm putting it into a sauce or something. So I do a lot of half pound packages because they thaw quicker, and I just want to throw deer meat in for tacos or bean dip or spaghetti or something like that. And you can do those 1/2 and 3/4 pound packages that you can't do when you're having them processed somewhere else. And yeah, squeeze them flat. They stack right in there like bricks. Doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, that's really one of the main benefits too of processing your own. As you consume more wild game and cook it for friends and family, you realize like, yeah, a pound package is not conducive. Or 6 butterfly medallions of backstrap, that doesn't make sense. I want 2-pound packs of burger. I want 1/2 pound packs of sausage. I want 1/3 of a strap, because I keep all my backstraps in like family size portions for my wife and son, where it's okay, this is about how much we eat. I'll freeze it as that, wrap it and freeze it, and then when it thaws out, if I want a medallion, and I will, or if I just want to cook the entire thing on the grill as a roast like that, I will as well. But you start realizing what makes sense, then you have the flexibility, then you can customize your kind of processing plan, if you will, that is conducive to your lifestyle and your eating habits, which is probably one of my favorites as well, because another kind of favorite cut of meat of mine is shanks. I absolutely love shanks, and it's something you can throw in a big brazier and cook them down and make osso buco and things of that nature. But you go to a processor, all that stuff typically just ends up in grind, or even or the dogs. I mean,
right, soup bones.
Yep, exactly.
So that was going to be my next question then. So you mentioned, is there another one that kind of people don't necessarily think of as far as what's kind of that hidden cut? What's one of your favorite cuts that maybe isn't as popular as, backstrap?
I mean, I think I'd say shanks. I love them. I think they have great flavor, but it's a slow and low, and they cook. It takes more time on an elk shank or a deer shank than it does for hog or beef and that matter, to break down all those connective tissues. But once it hits that right temperature, and all the silver skin and tallow and tendons, all that stuff just kind of disappears, and it's, I think, some of the best cuts on an animal.
So then how do you process that out? If somebody's listening and they say, all right, you know what? I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna keep a shank, but they've never done, like I said, everybody kind of falls into, and I'm guilty. I know how we're gonna eat that deer. So I don't deviate from how I process at this point. So if somebody decided, all right, I'm gonna keep a shank, Will, how do I keep that? What's it gonna change?
Yeah. So, a lot of times what I'll do is I will freeze it whole. I'll wrap it up really well, multiple layers of plastic, and we're talking elk shanks, but they're pretty large. Freeze it whole, get it rock solid, and then I try to eat them within 6 months or so. When it's time to eat it, I'll pull it out frozen still, and then I'll cut it in about 2.5 inch discs with the bone in. And that is a great way for the the kind of the osso buco braising experience. You get that bone marrow as well, and then you have those nice kind of they're more manageable sizes. So that's one of my preference. Another way is, if you don't want to mess with having to cut through bone and deal with that, is just deboning it and chunking it up, and then it still works great. I mean, you can throw it in an Instapot, and within 2 hours in an Instapot, that shank is broken down, versus like a big cast iron brazier may take several 8 or 9 hours to break it down. But yeah, I prefer to keep it on the bone, freeze it. When it's frozen, cut it into the desired pieces. Or if you don't want to mess with that, just debone it, and then you can if it's deboned, you can throw it in a vacuum bag and suck the air out and lay that thing really flat.
So now I'm sitting here thinking how I'm going to do, because so one of my favorite recipes that we've come up with here in the last few years, and it's usually more for beef because like I said, we get beef too because I like all the meats, so I'm not going to be without. And short ribs are one of those things that a lot of people don't. They just get what you can out of them, grind them, or they don't take them at all. But they'll go in the crock pot, and 6 or 7 hours in a crock pot with soy sauce and ginger, and then take them out and peel all that, because you've got it's ribs, so you've got all that belly lining that's on them, and then you've got
Yeah.
the ribs down, pull all that out of there, and you have just this most fall apart, unctuous, fatty, just heap of deliciousness, and just goes right in a stir fry. And I think you'd do the same thing with a shank. If you wanted to do the same thing with a shank, you just cook that down, get all that connective tissue out of there, because if you process it yourself, I know a lot of guys that just don't even mess with them, because it's just, especially on a whitetail, you're not talking about a lot of meat anyway. And by the time you trim all of that out of there, you've got like jerky strips of meat. And it's just like, why did I spend 20 minutes doing that? It wasn't. They'll save it for dog food. Some guys use it for trapping bait, whatever the case may be. Now I'm sitting here thinking, well, I'll just break the whole bottom half off of that shoulder and I will wrap it whole. And I think there isn't anything that some soy sauce and ginger can't turn into just a pretty edible piece of meat. And
Yeah,
all the
absolutely.
rest of that stuff is just going to disappear.
Yep, it truly does. And Hank Shaw has some really great shank recipes.
Yeah.
He kind of turned me on to it, reading some of his cookbooks and following some of his blogs. I would say he's got it figured out pretty well. So if you're looking for some inspiration on various shank recipes,
the wheels are turning. Now I just need
got
a
it
dead
dialed.
animal.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think just explore and experiment with, different cuts. I think that's really what it comes down to. I think, I always tell people that, food has become such a focal point in like entertainment. People like to kind of show off their, culinary experience and try something different, try something new. And, so many of those recipes that are with, traditional, hog or beef, that stuff translates very, very well over to wild game. And experiment, play around with it, and you can come up with some pretty awesome stuff down the road.
Well, and like you said, we're in interesting times where a lot more people are trying to do stuff for themselves that they hadn't done for themselves before. Some people that were already kind of that trended towards that anyway, and then we saw how quickly things can get silly on us with everything that went on with COVID. But I think generally speaking, people that hunt are tend towards doing things for themselves anyway. So when you talk about making sure that you're using the whole animal and experimenting with new things, by and large, it's a fun process. Like I said, for me, the next thing I'm going to try is corned venison, because who doesn't love a big smelly Reuben sandwich? And why not make it out of venison instead of beef? No reason that shouldn't work.
Yep. I mean, I've corned some roasts. I've never corned a brisket off of an elk or a deer, but I've corned some like hindquarter roasts, and it's awesome. It's kind of a fun experiment too.
Right. I mean, worst case scenario, you still have food. You may just need a little more sauce on it than usual to make sure that it's edible.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you're in pretty good shape, I think.
Yeah.
So we'll kind of start to put a bow on it here. Obviously, Outdoor Edge has a complete line of everything that you could possibly need. If you're sitting here going, I've got my kitchen knives and a fillet knife, what else would I need to get going? What kind of things, what would you recommend from Outdoor Edge to get people kind of jump started on their self-processing journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on, how deep of a dive you want to go into it. We do have complete kits that have, a big butcher knife, boning knife, caping knife, game shears, the whole 9 yards, or you can go to a very minimalist approach and just buy an individual fillet knife or boning knife. I think it really depends on each individual, the journey that they're looking to take on the processing experience. on what they need. I'm a bit more of a minimalist when it comes to it, where I typically have a good fillet knife and a good boning knife, and that's where I start with. And then, if you're, need to some
And
game.
honestly, not to cut you off, but like I think that's part of the intimidation too, is people think, well, I don't have a bone saw and I don't, they start listing all of the things that they don't have. And, you know, you've done this enough, I've done this enough and been around it enough. You could break down just about any animal on the continent with the same knife you use to gut them and take them out in a fillet knife. It might
Yep.
not be as easy as you would like it, and there may be some things that aren't done as cleanly as you would like it, but you're not breaking down an elephant. For the vast majority of us, the biggest thing we're going to break down is a white-tailed deer, which is about a quarter the size of the standard heifer that goes into the processing plant to make hamburgers. So, things like, obviously, if you're going to make your own burger, you need a grinder and some stuff like that. But in terms of separating what is edible from what isn't, this is not, if you think it's a big investment that you need to make to get to the point to be able to do that, it's not true. You already really have what you need, air quoting, in your house if you're a hunter. It's just a matter of, like kind of like what you were alluding to, how detailed are you wanting to get? And, also, are you killing one deer a year? Or are you going out west and taking an elk and taking 3 deer in your state and a hog in the spring and turkeys too? Some of it is, don't just look at it from, that isolated one instance, but what else may be part of it.
Yeah, and I think that, like you said, don't look at it as a giant investment. The biggest investment is going to be your time, which is an enjoyable investment. I think it's, it's a great way to kind of seal the story and, bring everything around, and another way to share the memories of the hunt with your friends and family, as I've been saying.
Well, and it's been one, even adults that I talk to that are so dissociated from our food supply chain. It's been really important to me for my boys to understand, okay, yeah, we're eating venison, but venison is, it's dead deer. When we eat pork, I don't tell them we're having pork. What's for supper? Dead pig. Just to have that schema of, this isn't just pork that magically descended from the deli cart at the grocery store. An animal died for this and you're eating it, and that's what this process looks like. And that being connected to it, and the locavore movement kind of predates what we've seen with COVID, but I think a lot of it kind of took it into high gear, where for myriad reasons, people started to question the supply chain and where things come from and how they're handled and everything that goes into it. And for those hunters with kids, especially if the kids are showing any interest of it at all, understanding what it takes to get from deer walking in the woods to, country fried venison backstrap. It's an important process that honestly I wish more people had more insight into, to know what that looks like and how food actually arrives on your plate. It saddens me that more people don't understand that process better.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I think, we are starting to see a little bit more of a change in it. COVID definitely helped drive it along, but, I was noticing that pre-COVID that people were showing more interest into it, but still kind of isolated pockets of people.
Yeah. Well, Will, I certainly appreciate you taking the time, jumping on. There were some really good tips in there. I know I'm already thinking about what I'm going to do with that venison shank. That'll be something different I do this year, so appreciate that. Before we let you go, where can people go to find information about Outdoor Edge, keep up with social media, all that kind of stuff? Been seeing you guys have really, I give you credit for really kind of changing the vibe that Outdoor Edge has had in social here in the last couple of years. It's if you're not already following them on, I see mostly on Instagram, but I'm sure you're other places as well. Some really good content out there. So tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find us at outdooredge.com on social. We are Outdoor Edge Knives. We have some great tips and tactics on our YouTube channel. Just search Outdoor Edge Knives. There's some great videos on breaking down animals, individual hindquarters, things of that nature. If you're looking to, explore our products, like I said, you can check us out online. And pretty much all major retailers and small mom and pop stores carry some of our products, from carry knives, hunting knives, to your full game processing kits.
Will, thank you again. Again, some really great information in there. If you are on the edge about processing your own game, on the edge, that was intentional. Clever. Certainly, there are more than enough resources out there. Will mentioned the videos that Outdoor Edge has. Take a little time. Don't wait until the animal's in the bed of your truck and you got to figure out what to do with it. Right now is the perfect time to go look and just watch a few videos and see, not that it's easy, but just see how you're already closer to doing the work than you think that you are. So definitely take a look at those resources. Pick up an extra knife or 6, because you can never have too many, and take that challenge on this fall. Will, thank you again for joining us, and good luck to you this fall.
Same to you. Thanks for having me, Trent.